Some locomotives are built to work in the desert, some locomotives are built to work on hills, and some locomotives are built to work anywhere. There were, however, a small handful of locomotives in North America that had the strange and arduous job of working underwater. By 1880, the Grand Trunk Railway had managed to establish connections between Chicago and the East Coast, allowing them to compete with many of the other railroads that moved both goods and passengers from Chicago to New York. This connection proved valuable to the railway, but suffered a severe drawback. In order to cross the St. Clair River that separated Michigan from Ontario, goods and passengers would have to transfer to a ferry which took them across the water. From there, they'd transfer onto another train in order to continue the journey. Even after switching to roll-on, roll-off ferries, this significantly bottlenecked the railway's overall efficiency, and so the railway made the decision to build a tunnel under the river, saving the need to waste time by crossing the river by boat. Construction began in 1888, and by 1891 the 1.8-kilometre tunnel was officially open to traffic, operated by the St. Clair Tunnel Company. There was, however, an issue. The rails on both sides sloped downwards at a 2% grade before levelling out in the middle, meaning an engine would literally have to climb uphill both ways. On top of that, despite all the ventilation installed, a regular steam locomotive would very quickly fill the tunnel with smoke, and so it was decided that specialist locomotives were needed which would not only be strong enough to pull passengers and freight cars up the tunnel grades, but also not choke the engine crews with fumes. To do the job, 4 010 tank engines were ordered from the Baldwin Locomotive Works. They were rather unconventional in design, having their water tanks mounted lower down closer to their wheels, the driver's cab set in the middle of the engine, and from the pictures, what appears to be 2 domes for holding sand. Having the cab set in the middle of the engine gave the driver a clear view in both directions, allowing them to be driven both in forwards and in reverse, saving the need to turn them around, while the firemen, it seems, would have stood at the back of the engine without much protection. Despite their unusual appearance, they were exceptional performers, capable of pulling over 760 tons through the tunnel and trains made up of over 30 cars, though rarely going faster than 15 miles an hour. They were so strong they often accidentally broke couplings, and even more impressively, each engine weighed in at just over 88 metric tons, making them the heaviest locomotives ever built at the time. In an attempt to decrease the buildup of smoke, the engines burned anthracite coal and the tunnel was well ventilated. But even with all this, the fumes were a massive issue. It reportedly took 45 minutes for all the gases to clear completely, but given that the railway on average ran 6 trains an hour through the tunnel, you can imagine it wasn't always the most comfortable experience for passengers and engine crew. It's said that the fumes weren't a problem if the train went through the tunnel without delay, however the steep climb on both sides often caused the link and pin couplings used at the time to break. Conductors and brakemen who were stationed in the caboose would sometimes end up stranded in the tunnel, choking in fumes while the engine crew had to quickly come back and retrieve them. Conductor George Hawthorne died in one such incident only 3 months after the tunnel was opened in January 1892. Couplings breaking in the tunnel were unfortunately common, no thanks to the engine's immense power, with an incident occurring on average 70 times a year. In 1898, the engines were modified, being given tenders to increase their fuel capacity, having their water tanks removed, and being equipped with modern knuckle couplers. Despite the changes, the couplings continued to break in the tunnel, and the fumes remained an ever-present danger. After the 3rd fatal accident in the tunnel caused the death of 6 people in 1904, the railway decided to electrify the line in order to resolve the fume issue. Overhead power lines were installed and 6 electric locomotives came into service in 1908, built by both Westinghouse and Baldwin. While these six-wheeled engines weren't as powerful as the steam engines that came before them, they were faster, could be easily paired up to pull heavier trains, and most importantly, wouldn't fill the tunnel with fumes while in operation. Electrifying the tunnel came with the added benefit that the railway was also able to provide electricity to their nearby stations, the roundhouse, tunnel lights, pumping stations, and local YMCA buildings. The O10Os remained in service along with the electric engines for a few years before finally being put to one side. Eventually, the first steam engine was cut up in 1916, with the remaining three being scrapped by the end of 1920. Two more electric engines were purchased in 1927, with the final addition to the railway coming in the form of an overhead wire maintenance engine in 1941. By 1958, however, diesel locomotives were becoming more dominant in North America, and capable of traversing the tunnel on their own. At this point, the electric locomotives and equipment were getting expensive to maintain, and so Canadian National, who now owned the railway, decided to do away with the electric engines and simply operate the line as a normal tunnel. All the locomotives used on the line were scrapped after being withdrawn. As the years went by, freight cars got bigger and bigger, until eventually they were too big to safely pass through the tunnel, meaning ferries had to be used again to carry some of the larger cars over the river. To rectify the issue, another, larger tunnel was dug next to the original in 1994, allowing the bigger cars to safely pass under the river. The original tunnel was closed off the same year, but still remains visible as it became a National Historic Landmark in 1993. It's a shame really that none of the engines that worked on the St. Clair Tunnel have been preserved, especially the steam locomotives. Despite their unusual design and drawbacks, you have to admit they do carry a certain charm. Though I think you'll agree, I'd rather travel behind an electric engine and not risk choking on coal fumes. Don't you? Subscribe for more.